Alright, for this video lesson, this is the second one. We're going to spend a second day going over point 2, and it's actually point 2 and point 3, and we're just going to go over a lot of basic adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing, and we're going to throw in a lot of rules with signs when we have positives and negatives when adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. You can see the first definition I have up here. I have absolute value, and we're going to use this a lot when we add a positive and a negative. Definition is the distance between a number and 0 on the number line. And here's the notation for it. You'll have what's called absolute value bars. Let's say you have 3. Okay, the absolute value of 3 is 3 because it's 3 units from 0. Now if I make it negative 3, the absolute value of negative 3 is also 3 because that's still 3 units from 0. So the main thing is, when you talk about absolute value, since you talk about distance can never be negative. You know, you never say, oh, I traveled a negative distance. No, you give a direction, but then you give them, you know, the distance that you traveled. So these are always positive here. We're going to deal basically this absolute value once we get to this part, when we add numbers with different signs, meaning we add a positive and a negative. Okay, first simple case that we'll look at when we're adding integers is same sign. And the two cases when we add two positive integers or when we add two negative integers. Well, when we add two positive integers, well, that's the easiest case. When you add two positives, your answer is a positive. Okay, pretty straightforward there. You know, I could put examples here. You know, I could put 5 plus 7. Well, real easy. They're both positive. So 5 plus 7, you just add those up and you get 12. Okay, two negative integers. When we add two negative integers, our result is also going to be a negative integer. Okay, I'm going to look at this two ways. One way I'm going to look at it is kind of a visual method. Let's look at an example. Okay, let's make it negative 3 plus negative 7. Okay, if I look at this example, I'm going to put this right above. You guys can just pay attention here. This is how, whenever I add positives and negatives, especially when I have negatives, I always imagine the real number line. Okay, I kind of get a visual of that. Let's say I have, let's say this is negative 3 right here. 4, let's see here, negative 4, negative 5, negative 6. Negative 7, negative 8, negative 9, negative 10, negative 11. Okay, and let's say this is negative 4. I'm going to start here on the real number line. So this is where I start this negative 3. And if you're adding a negative 7, well, if you have a negative, then that means you're going to go 7 units to the left. So if I, from here, go 7 units to the left, I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, and if I count this as what? Negative 5, negative 6, negative 7, negative 8, negative 9, negative 10. That's where I end up. So since I went to the left 7, I subtracted 7 from negative 3. So this is my answer, negative 10. Now that's the visual method. The other easy method is just add the numbers. If they're both negative, add 3 and 7, you get 10. Well, since they're both negative, then leave the negative with it. So you get negative 10. Okay, another way of doing this, you'll hear Mrs. Hannah say this all the time. One of the things she does to explain this, imagine if you had a negative number, it's like you owe someone money. So if you had negative 3, it's like you're saying, okay, I owe you $3. If you have negative 7, I owe you $7. So if I owe you $3 and then I owe you $7, I'm $10 in debt. So in all, I owe you $10. Alright, the one example where we have to think a little bit here, and we use absolute value is different signs. Okay, different signs right here. I'm going to give you two different examples. Let's say I'm going to give you, let's go 8 plus negative 3. When you add numbers with different signs, you basically can subtract the numbers and keep the sign of the number with the bigger absolute value, or the biggest absolute value. Well, if I take the difference, I'm just going to look at this. If I take the difference of 8 and 3, that gives me 5. And this 5 is going to be, the answer is going to be left with the one with the bigger absolute value. 8, it has a bigger absolute value than negative 3, and 8's positive, so that's my answer. Now if I switch it around and I did negative 8 plus 3, again, if I take the difference of 8 and 3, it's still 5. But now I leave the number, or I leave the sign with the bigger absolute value. In this case, 8's still the bigger absolute value, but in this case 8's negative, so I'm going to end up with negative 5 here. And I could do the whole visual method. I could start at negative 8 and then go to the right 3, since you're adding 3, and you're going to end up here at negative 5. So this case here, you can get a positive or you can get a negative. Whichever number has the biggest absolute value, you take the sign of that. So 8 was the biggest absolute value for both of these. Here it's positive, so here we end up with a positive. Okay, 8 had the bigger absolute value. Here it was a negative, so I end up with a negative. Alright, let's look at some examples here. Okay, negative 1 plus 4. This is just like the different signs. I'm adding these. I really can subtract it and do 4 minus 1 is 3. Well, since 4 has the bigger absolute value and it's positive, this stays positive. Okay, this one, again, I'm adding a negative and a positive. If I take the difference of 7 and 3, I get 4. But now the bigger absolute value is this. Is the 7 and it's negative, so this is a negative. Okay, these are both negative, so my answer is going to be negative. I just add 3 and 8 and I get 11. And then these are two positives. I just add those, 7 plus 8. I still get a positive, it's 15. Okay, subtracting. Subtracting is just like adding a negative. So like number 5, I'll squeeze this in right here. 3 minus 5 is just like saying 3 plus negative 5. So you're adding a positive and negative. You take the difference of 3 and 5 and it's 2. But since this is the bigger absolute value, the 5, and it's negative, we get negative 2. Okay, negative 1 minus 5, that's just like saying negative 1 plus negative 5. You add two negatives, you end up with a negative, and 1 plus 5 is 6, so you get negative 6. Okay, and then let's see here, 4 minus 8, this is like saying 4 plus negative 8. You're adding a positive and a negative. Difference between 8 and 4 is 4. 8's the bigger absolute value, and 8's negative, so we get negative 4. 13 minus 2, it's like saying 13 plus negative 2. So if you take the difference of 13 and 2, you get, was it 11? And 13 obviously is the bigger absolute value. Since it's a positive, we leave 11 as positive. Okay, now the only thing that gets a little tricky for these last two, if you add numbers, if you subtract a negative here, this is where you have to change it to a positive. So you hear us say add a line, change the sign. So you add a line right there and then change the sign. Same thing here for 10. So this is going to become 11 plus 7. Okay, negative 2 plus 7. Let's see here. If you're adding a negative and a positive, you take the difference of 7 and 2, which is 5. 7 is the bigger absolute value, which is positive, so this is positive. And then here, these are both positive, so 11 plus 7 is 18. Okay, should be a lot of basic stuff here. Okay, let's go to the next page. Alright, next page right here. We're going to keep it simple. We're going to clump multiplying and dividing. The rules for that when you have positive numbers and negative numbers. Let's just first fill this out, and then we'll look at the numbers, which should be pretty easy. Everything you're doing, you can say, should be pretty much mental math, or you're referring back to the real number line to give you a visual. Alright, first case, if you are multiplying or dividing two positive numbers, your result is a positive. I'll just put a plus. If you multiply or divide two negatives, the two negatives cancel out when multiplying or dividing, and you still get a positive. Now, if they're different signs, if you take a positive multiplier divided by a negative, you end up with a negative. And if you switch the order around, if you have a negative times or divided by a positive, you still get a negative. So it's even much easier to remember this. Different signs, you get a negative. If you multiply two numbers with the same sign, then you get a positive. Okay, so if I look at number 1, these are different signs. 2 times negative 6, so I'm going to get a negative. And then 2 times 6 is 12. Number 2, they're both different signs, so I'm going to end up with a negative. 32 divided by 8 is negative 4. So this is all mental math. You should get this right away. You could even pause the video, get the answers, and then fast forward it and see if it's right. 3, you're multiplying two negatives, so they're going to cancel out. 5 times 6 is 30, so that's it. 4, they're different signs, so I'm going to get a negative. 18 divided by 3 is going to give us 6, so we end up with negative 6. Okay, number 5, even though we have a negative in here, here's one of kind of like a special case. If you multiply anything by 0, you get 0. Okay, number 6, you are dividing two negatives, so these negatives are going to cancel out. So 27 divided by 3 is 9, and that's it. You don't get negative 9 because the two negatives cancel out. 7 is real easy. If you multiply two positives, you get a positive. 5 times 9 is 45. And number 8, you're dividing different signs, so you're going to get a negative. And 55 divided by 5 is 11, so your answer is negative 11. All right, so that should be real easy there. If you multiply numbers with the same sign or divide, they're a positive. If you divide or multiply different signs, you get a negative right here. Okay, just using those simple rules and basic math, we don't need any calculator for anything. You shouldn't have used any calculator on any of these. The only thing you probably could have used was maybe a visual of using the real number line when you had positives and negatives.